Hello everyone, this is Patrick Omoumi speaking from Lausanne in Switzerland, and this talk is going to be about the Dixon technique and its many facets in musculoskeletal imaging. Now, there are many facets to cover here, and we don't have the time to touch upon everything, so I will be selecting for you those applications which have actually made it into our routine and that we use on a daily basis. But before we jump in, I'd like to make a very quick refresher on the physics of the MRI of the Dixon technique. These are two hydrogen atoms or protons, and as you know, the signal in conventional MRI comes from those protons. But these are slightly different though. One of them is attached to a fat molecule, and the other one is actually attached to a water molecule. And as you can imagine, looking at this diagram, those have a little bit of difference in their magnetic environment, which creates a difference in their resonance frequency. So the protons of water and fat present what is called a chemical shift, which as a consequence makes them being in phase or out of phase periodically. When water and fat protons are in phase, their signal adds up. When they are out of phase, their signal cancels out. So if you acquire images when they are in phase and out of phase, and you start subtracting and adding those images, you can reconstruct additional images. If you, for example, add those two images, you can reconstruct a water-only image, as you can see, by applying this formula here. Now, if you subtract the second image from this first one, you can reconstruct a fat-only image, as you can see on this image here and this formula. So the Dixon sequence is actually providing you with 4 sets of images, an in-phase and out-of-phase sets of sequences from which you can reconstruct water-only and fat-only images. Now, we've been using this technique for a while as a fat suppression technique, and it has the advantages to be more robust than chess chemical selective techniques, and it has higher signal-to-noise ratio than the stir sequences. So it makes it an ideal choice for large field of view applications, such as imaging of the spine or imaging of the extremities, such as the hands. So we've applied this Dixon technique to our spine protocol and have been using it regularly. That provides you with the added benefit of having in one single acquisition both the non-fat suppressed and the fat suppressed sequences. If you combine that to T1 sequences, you have all you need to both detect and characterize lesions, especially bone marrow lesions. T1 provides you the information of whether a lesion has more or less fat than it should have, and your reference is always the muscle edges adjacent to the bone you're looking at. These two lesions, the fat content is increased. These are typical of hemangiomas, while in this third lesion, the fat content is decreased. The signal intensity is lower than that of the adjacent muscle. This was a bone replacement lesion in case of prostate metastasis. So now our question was whether we could replace the information provided to us by the T1 weighted sequences by the fat images. And we've actually assessed that and showed that for the detection of metastasis of solid tumors, the set of sequences of images provided to you by a single acquisition of a fast pinnacle T2 Dixon sequence can replace the information provided by the set of conventional sequences that you usually acquire, including T1 sequences. That allows you to get rid of your T1 and decrease your acquisition time and increase patient comfort. If you use fat images, it also actually makes your life a bit easier. Here you can see that you would be guessing if this lesion would have lower or higher signal intensity on T1 than the adjacent muscle. Whereas in this case here, there is no more signal coming from inside the lesion, which tells you that there is no more fat left. This is a bone marrow replacement lesion. This is a metastasis. The contrast to noise ratio of the fat images, as you can see, is much higher than T1 sequences, and that makes it easier to detect lesions. As you can see, this lesion over here is barely visible on T1, whereas it's very nicely and easily detected on fat images. This higher contrast to noise ratio is particularly interesting for multiple myeloma, where lesions have low contrast on T1 intrinsically, as you know. By using fat images, you can significantly increase your contrast to noise ratio, as we have shown. That makes it much easier to detect those myeloma lesions on fat images compared to T1 sequences. We wanted to push this a step further, and we look at the workup of lumbar back pain and lumbar radiculopathy. So we have actually shown that for the routine lumbar spine MRI, the single acquisition of a fast Spinnaker T2 Dixon technique can replace the set of conventional sequences that we usually use. And you can delete your T1 from your protocol in that case. The morphological sequences provided by T1 is provided by the in-phase T2 weighted sequences. The fat images provide you the information on fat content of focal bone marrow lesions or fat involvement, for example, to characterize modic changes, while the water-only images are basically the same as your classic fluid-sensitive fat-suppressed sequences, which you use to detect inflammation, for example. And by the way, morphological changes, fatty involution, and edema and inflammation is all you need to diagnose and work up spondyloarthritis. It's been shown that to detect sacroiliitis and to diagnose sacroiliitis, the only thing you need is one single acquisition of a fast Spinnaker T2 Dixon sequence. This is true for the sacroiliac joints, but can be extended to the lumbar spine as well, or to the rest of the spine actually. And we have deleted T1 weighted sequences from our protocols in the workup of spondyloarthritis. Now let's look at this lesion over here. This was a patient with the breast carcinoma, and the PET-CT showed this lesion with a slight uptake in the lumbar spine. We performed MRI to make sure that this was not a metastasis, and fat images showed us that there was still signal coming from inside this lesion, which is usually reassuring, meaning that the bone marrow is preserved. The T2 weighted sequences, the in-phase images, showed that the signal intensity of the lesion was slightly lower than that of the adjacent bone marrow, which is compatible with an island of red marrow. But can we be sure? Is there a way to increase our diagnostic confidence using the information provided by the Dixon technique? Whereas there's one set of images that we haven't looked at yet, the out-of-phase images. And those contain quantitative information combined with in-phase images. The idea is to place an ROI on your lesion and to measure the relative amount of water and fat. In benign lesions, the fat of bone marrow is preserved and will create a signal drop on out-of-phase images, canceling the signal of the water protons. Now, in malignant lesions, the fat is replaced by tumoral cells. So the signal drop that is generated on out-of-phase images is lower than 20% usually. In that case, the signal drop was above 20%, 35%, which was consistent with a benign lesion. This can be applied to the differentiation of benign and malignant vertebral compression fractures. Benign fractures will have a signal drop of above 20%, while malignant fractures will have a signal drop of below 20%. And we've shown this in a paper which was being published in European Radiology. Now let's move on to our last application, to oncology. My question to you is, do you think that whether this tumor enhances or not? And if you look at the post-contrast T1 fat-suppressed image here, you might be tempted to say yes. But now if you look and compare the non-fat suppressed pre- and post-contrast T1 sequences, there is no evidence of enhancement here. The reason why your lesion appears to be high in signal intensity on that image is because you have suppressed the signal of fat. And by doing so, you've increased your dynamic range of your image. The signal intensity of the lesion will be artificially increased, just as you would increase contrast on your liver CT to detect metastasis. This is exactly the same phenomenon here. So to assess the enhancement of a lesion, you absolutely need to make sure you only change one parameter between your pre and post contrast images. Here, two parameters had been changed, both the addition of contrast, gadolinium, as well the addition of fat suppression. So in oncology, combining the Dixon technique with the post-contrast T1 sequences has many advantages. It can provide you with non-fat suppressed sequences that you can compare to the pre-contrast T1 sequences. It can provide you with the fat suppressed T1 enhanced T1 sequences, which best delineate the extension of the tumor. And it can also give you information about the fat content of the lesion. And by the way, keep in mind that those fat images are specific to fat. So adding contrast doesn't actually change the contrast of your image. So you can assess the fat content even post-contrast. If you acquire, in addition to that, pre-contrast T1 and T2 sequences, you have all you need to characterize your lesion. So my take-home messages here is that you should definitely use the Dixon technique. It's a very useful technique, as we just saw. Make sure that your fat images in particular are sent automatically to your PACS, because all vendors don't do that. So make sure that does happen from your scanners. As you saw, it's a very nice and robust technique to suppress fat, especially useful in large field of view sequence applications or for the imaging of the extremities. It has completely changed the way we've viewed bone marrow imaging, and has replaced and it actually improved the information provided to us by T1 sequences. It's also very useful combined with the tumor protocols. So with that, I thank you for your attention. We didn't have the time to cover all of the facets of the Dixon technique, but hopefully there will be other opportunities in the near future for me to go back and talk about that, especially if it is in person. Thank you very much, and see you soon.